Good morning students. Our chapter number 6 combustion and flame is going on. In the first two periods we learn about meaning of combustion, combustible and non-combustible substances and how air is required for the combustion. Then we learn about ignition temperature of different substances and history of matchstick. Up to activity 6.4 we covered in the last period. Today we will see the remaining part of this chapter. Now see the activity 6.4. First, you read the question. Be careful while handling burning candle. Be careful while handling burning candle. Now, for this activity, we required one sheet of paper, some amount of water, and two candles. Two candles. Now, see the activity. Make two paper cups by folding a sheet of paper. We have to take a sheet of paper. From that, we have to prepare two paper cups. Pour about 50 ml of water in one of the cups. Some amount of water, 50 ml water we have to put in a one paper cup. Heat both the cups separately with a candle. You can see in the image also. We have to heat both the paper cups separately with a candle. And what do you observe? What do you observe? And what happens to the empty paper cups? Empty paper cup burn, it can burn easily. What happens to the paper cup with water? It cannot burn easily. And does water in this cup become hot? Yes, it becomes hot because of heat. If we continue heating the cup, we can even boil water in the paper cup. Water in the paper cup. And can you think of an explanation for this phenomena? What is the explanation for this activity? Now see, already it is given here. The heat supplied to paper cup is transferred to water by conduction. You have one chapter number 4, heat chapter. In that we will learn about the conduction method. Now see here, when heat is supplied to that particular paper cup which have water in that, what happened that time? When we provided heat for that paper cup, it transferred to the water. It's transferred to the water by the conduction method. And so in the presence of water, the ignition temperature of the paper is not reached and hence it does not burn. What happened that time? Because of the presence of water, the ignition temperature of the paper is not reached and that's why it does not burn. I will tell you a simple activity. You have to take two papers. One is a dry paper and one is a wet paper, and we have to start burning both the papers. What happened? Dry paper, it can burn easily. Because it has a low ignition temperature, and but wet paper, it cannot burn easily because the presence of water. The ignition temperature of the paper is not reached and that's why it does not burn. Now the substances which have very low ignition temperature and can easily catch fire with a flame is called inflammable substances. The substances which catch the fire, it is called as a combustible material. It's called as a combustible substances. We will take here instead of substance, combustible material. The combustible material which have very low ignition temperature and can easily catch the fire with a flame are called inflammable substances. All combustible material, they can burn easily and they have their own ignition temperature, but from that the substances which have very low ignition temperature and can catch easily fire are called inflammable substances. And the example of inflammable substances are petrol, alcohol, liquefying petroleum gas, LPG, which we are using in our home for cooking purpose. Now can you list some more inflammable substances? I will tell you some examples of the inflammable substances: paint thinners and removers, benzene, fireworks, magnesium and zinc powder. Now our next point is, how do we control the fire? You must have seen or heard of fire breaking out in homes, shops and factories. If you have seen such an accident, write a short description in your notebook. Also share the experience with your classmate. Now in news or in your daily life, you can see or you can heard about the fire breaking out in homes, shops and factories. factories. Suppose you saw that or you seen that, you have to write a short description in your notebook and you share your experiences with your classmate. Now here important message was given that find out the telephone number of the fire service in your area. If a fire breaks out in your house or in your neighborhood, the first thing to do is to call the fire service. Suppose you find out the fire. If a fire breaks out in your home or in your neighborhood, the first thing you have to do to call the fire service. And it is important that all of us to know the telephone number of fire service, and I will tell you that fire service helpline number is 101. Now, does your city or town have a fire brigade station? Suppose you are living in a city, that's your city definitely have a fire brigade station. Definitely they have a fire brigade station. Now here, when a fire brigade arrives, what does it do? Suppose fire is breaking out in home, shops or factories, and the fire brigade is arrives. That time what they are doing, they are pouring some water. It pours water on the fire, which is shown in figure 6.6. You see the figure 6.6. Firemen extinguish the fire by throwing water under pressure. Now here, when fire brigade arrives, what does it do? It pours water on the fire, which is shown in figure 6.6. And what is the use of water? Water cools the combustible material so that its temperature is brought below its ignition temperature. And what is the use of water? Water cools the combustible material so that its temperature is brought below to its ignition temperature. इथे वॉटरचा यूज काय? ज्यावेळेस आपण कंबस्टिबल मटेरियल, एखादा कंबस्टिबल मटेरियल आपण लक्षात घेतो, त्यावेळेस आपल्याला काय समजते की त्याची हीट, त्याला दिलेली हीट ही त्याच्या इग्नायशन टेम्परेचरपेक्षा जास्त गेली नाही तर तो जळू शकत नाही. आणि कधी जळतो तर त्याला दिलेली हीट ही त्याच्या इग्नायशन टेम्परेचरपेक्षा जास्त गेली तर तो जळायला चालू करतो. आणि त्यावेळेस वॉटर काय करतं, पाणी काय करतं, ज्यावेळेस आपण पाणी फायर ब्रिगेडवाले जे पाणी मारतात त्यामुळे काय होतं, ते पाणी काय करतं, त्या कंबस्टिबल मटेरियलला थंड करतं. कधीपर्यंत थंड करतं, ते त्या इग्नायशन टेम्परेचरपेक्षा खाली आणतं. आणि त्यामुळे काय होतं, ते फायर स्प्रेड होण्यापासून थांबते. Water cools the combustible material so that its temperature brought below to its ignition temperature, and this prevents the fire from spreading. And water vapors also surround the combustible material, helping in cutting off the supply of air so the fire is extinguished. And in another way it is also helpful. When we are pour the water is converted into the water vapors because of the heat, and water vapors surround the combustible material and helping the cutting the supply of air, which means oxygen, and so the fire will be extinguished. You have learned that there are 3 essential requirements for producing fire, and can you list these requirements? From these all the activities we learn that for the combustion, for the fire, 3 things are required. And these are fuel, air to supply of oxygen, and heat to raise the temperature of the fuel beyond the ignition temperature. In a simple language I will tell you, these are fuel means combustible material. एक जळणारी वस्तू हवी, न जळणारी वस्तू असेल तर ती जळणारच नाहीये. जळणारी वस्तू हवी आपल्याला. एक एअर, सेकंड एअर टू सप्लाय ऑक्सिजन, ऑक्सिजनचा सप्लाय करण्यासाठी एअर पाहिजे. देन हीट, रेज द टेम्परेचर ऑफ द फ्युएल बियॉन्ड द इग्नायशन टेम्परेचर. हीट कशासाठी हवे तर टेम्परेचर, त्या वस्तूचं टेम्परेचर हे वाढवण्यासाठी, त्याच्या इग्नायशन टेम्परेचरपेक्षा जास्त करण्यासाठी, तेव्हा ती जळू शकेल. ह्या 3 गोष्टी आपल्याला पाहिजेत. वेन फायर कॅन बी कंट्रोल्ड बाय रिमूव्हिंग 1 or more of these requirement. ह्या 3 गोष्टी ज्या आहेत त्या फायरसाठी रिक्वायरमेंट आहेत, फायर तयार होण्यासाठी रिक्वायरमेंट आहेत. आणि फायर कंट्रोल करायचं असेल तर काय करावं लागेल, त्यातल्या आपल्याला एखादी किंवा एक किंवा एकापेक्षा जास्त जी रिक्वायरमेंट आहे ती कमी करावी लागेल, त्यावेळेस ती फायर थांबू शकते. द जॉब ऑफ फायर एक्सटिंग्विशर इज टू कट ऑफ द सप्लाय ऑफ एअर or to bring down the temperature of the fuel. We already learned that in the upper para. The water cools the combustible material, so its temperature is brought below to the ignition temperature. In this way they are bring down the temperature of the fuel, and because of water vapors the supply of air will be cut there. Supply of air will be cut there. In this way the job of fire extinguisher is to cut off the supply of air or to bring down the temperature of the fuel, or both. Notice that the fuel in the most cases cannot be eliminated. सपोज एखादी वस्तू जळते घरामध्ये, पेपर असेल, काही काही छोटी मोठी छोटी वस्तू असेल, तर ती काय आपण इझिली बाहेर फेकू शकतो किंवा त्याला थांबवू शकतो. बट फॉर if for an instance a building catches fire, the whole building is a fuel. सपोज एखादी मोठी बिल्डिंगच आग लागली असेल तर त्यावेळेस ती मोठी बिल्डिंग ही कंबस्टिबल मटेरियल आहे, त्याला आपण बाहेर सेपरेट नाही करू शकत. फॉर दॅट पर्पज हिअर इट इज मेन्शन्ड. Notice that the fuel in most cases cannot be eliminated. It is most important. Now upper side most important information was provided there. The most common fire extinguisher is water. The most common fire extinguisher we are using in our home is water. But water works only when things like wood and paper are on fire. But this water, there are the limitation of the waters we are using extinguisher as a water. There are some limitations. But water works only when the things of wood and paper are on fire. Suppose if an electrical equipment is on fire, that time we cannot use the water, because water may conduct the electricity and harm those trying to douse the fire, who are stop the fire, the person who are working for stop the fire. Water is also not suitable for fires involving oil and petrol. Because we are already aware about that water is heavier than oil. And petrol, so it sink below the oil, and oil keeps burning on the top. I'll tell you in Marathi. सगळ्यात मोस्ट कॉमन फायर एक्सटिंग्विशर म्हणून आपण वॉटर वापरतो, पाणी, आग थांबवण्यासाठी पाणी वापरतो. पण त्याला सुद्धा एक लिमिटेशन्स आहेत. कधीपर्यंत जर आग एखाद्या लाकडाला, एखाद्या पेपरला लागली असेल तर आपण पाणी वापरू शकतो. पण एखादी आग ही इलेक्ट्रिकल इक्विपमेंटला लागली असेल तर त्यावेळेस आपण पाणी वापरू शकत नाही. कारण का पाणी आपल्याला माहिती आहे, पाणी काय आहे, ते इलेक्ट्रिसिटी कंडक्ट करतं, आणि ज्यामुळे तो एखादा व्यक्ती आहे, तो पाणी ती आग थांबवण्यासाठी गेलाय, त्यामुळे काय करतो, पाणी त्यामधून इलेक्ट्रिसिटी वाहू शकते आणि तो पर्टिक्युलर पर्सनला ते हार्मफुल होऊ शकतं. आणि सपोज वॉटर इज नॉट सुटेबल फॉर फायर्स involving oil and petrol, because we are aware about that water is heavier than oil. When we pour water, that time what happen, water will be go downside of the oil, and upper side of the water, oil will become, and it starts burning, it keep on burning. For fire involving electrical equipment, now for that purpose what we have to do, what is the next fire extinguisher? For fires involving electrical equipment and inflammable materials like petrol, carbon dioxide is the best extinguisher. Now we are not using for the fire, for the electrical equipment or for the petrol and diesel, we are not using water. But for that purpose what we have to use? We have to use carbon dioxide as the best extinguisher. For fire involving electrical equipment and inflammable materials like petrol, carbon dioxide is the best extinguisher. Carbon dioxide being heavier than oxygen, CO2, it means carbon dioxide being heavier than oxygen, and covers the fire like a blanket, and since the contact between the fuel and oxygen is cut off, and the fire is controlled. The added advantage of carbon dioxide is that in the most of the cases it does not harm the electrical equipment. Suppose any material, electrical equipment or inflammable material like petrol and diesel or electrical equipment will be catch on fire. That time what we have to use? We have to use carbon dioxide. And what is the criteria? What is the work of carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen, and it covers the fire like a blanket, and since the contact between the fuel and oxygen is cut off, we are aware about that for the fire oxygen is required, and when the contact between the fuel and oxygen is cut off, that time fire can be easily controlled. And the added advantage of carbon dioxide is that most cases it does not harm the electrical equipment. Now, how do we get the supply of carbon dioxide? How do we get the supply of carbon dioxide? You can see in a bank or many more offices, you can see in this type of cylinders which is hanged on the wall. See in the image, fire extinguisher. How do we get the supply of carbon dioxide? It can be stored at high pressure as a liquid in cylinders. Liquid in the cylinder. You can see in the image also. In what forms the LPG stored in the cylinder? We are aware about that how LPG is stored in the cylinder in a liquid form. And when it released from the cylinder, carbon dioxide expand enormously in huge amount in a volume and the cools down. So it not only forms a blanket around the fire, it also brings down the temperature of the fuel. That is why it is an excellent fire extinguisher. It is an excellent fire extinguisher. When when the carbon dioxide is released from the cylinder, that time it expands enormously and it in volume and cools down the temperature of that particular material below the ignition temperature. That is why it is an excellent fire extinguisher. Another way to get carbon dioxide to release a lot of dry powder of chemicals like sodium bicarbonate, which is called as a baking soda, or potassium bicarbonate near the fire, and these chemicals give off carbon dioxide. Another way to get carbon dioxide to release a lot of dry powder like chemicals like sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, or potassium bicarbonate near to the fire, and these chemicals give off carbon dioxide and which cut off the supply of oxygen, and we can control the fire. Today up to this we covered, remaining part we will see in the next period.